Hello and very welcome to the talk. Today,
and ultimately control the people. And then final point is that, I see this developing, the Taliban in Afghanistan as well. Is when we really look at the capabilities that exist among any revolutionary movement that's driven by whether it's a political or economic, rigid political radical ideology, or whether it's driven by a religious extreme ideology in the case of radical Islam with the Taliban, their operational capacity to actually run a government are really, really poor. And this clearly also has been the case in Cuba. And so, all the way back, really upon taking power, what are the first things Castro does? Does he look to improve the lot of the Cuban people? No, he immediately begins looking abroad. He ultimately meddles in North Africa, meddles in the Middle East after the Yom Kippur War, gets engaged in supporting Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia, one of the most brutal tyrants of our time.
yeah,
And the MPLA in Angola. He sends, ultimately tens of thousands of troops into Africa.
yeah,
I mean, you think of the allocation of resources in a poor country with real needs. And then, of course, famously supports revolutionary movements in our own hemisphere in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras. This has been the story of modern Cuba, and I believe the position of the United States, just kind of wrapping this up on the kind of summation of my ideas on this, is that the economic embargo on Cuba is one that continually gets debated because you'll often hear its opponents say, well, look, it's not working. The communists are still in control. I want to respond, to that, because the goal of the embargo was never regime control. It was to deny, and it remains to deny the regime the resources to wreak havoc domestically and globally. And in that sense, the communist regime has had its capabilities diminished. And I saw that firsthand in Angola. I saw that firsthand in Nicaragua, where they desperately wanted to see those communist regimes prevail. You've seen it in diminished capacity with their drug running efforts. They'd be doing as much as they still are doing. They'd be doing even more if we were trading with them. And that's the final point. There's a big difference between putting an embargo on a free market or a mixed economy and putting an embargo on a communist regime, in the sense that when you trade with a communist regime, you're trading with the government, period, end of story, full stop. And this has been the case. I mean, even with humanitarian aid that we've attempted to send to Cuba in periods of need and ongoing, is that it's siphoned off by the military, or it's, given to the party members first and foremost, not getting where it needs. It's very difficult. You have no real vibrant private sector partnerships that you can develop trade relationships with like you could in a more hybrid or market-oriented economy.
Thank you, Michael. I have written some questions somewhere here, something I was thinking last night. And one interesting question that really interests me a lot as a Cuban person is that, yes, Castro took power the 1st January 1959. Everybody knows that. And which of both was the first to throw a stone one another? Who triggered the trigger first? From where came the aggression? And in your point of view, which were the major mistakes of Eisenhower Kennedy administration toward Castro?
I think the fundamental error that Eisenhower made was firstly underestimating the fact that as imperfect as Batista was in his governance, and he had abused human rights, he had suspended the Constitution. So there's a first sort of presidential era of his leadership, but then you look at then he leaves for Florida, he returns to Cuba. when he comes back, he doesn't look poised to win in that election. And that begins a period in which he takes a much more autocratic political position in Cuba than he had historically. And he changes, and he puts, sadly, his aspirations for personal power above those of principle and liberty and freedom, and that were, in that Constitution. And so the mistake we make, and it's a mistake that we have made, that Carter made later in Iran and Nicaragua, those are two prominent examples, is that whenever you undermine or isolate a government, you have to ponder the fact that you are empowering the domestic enemies of that government. Well, in the case of Cuba, they knew full well that there was a communist insurgency that was organizing and was active and growing. And in putting that embargo, and basically in isolating Batista and withdrawing much of the support that we had provided him, the conditions in Cuba worsened, which increased the political support for the communists, for Castro and the insurgency, because it's always easier, isn't it, to support a movement that has only rhetoric and hasn't had to deliver on its promises versus a government that's actually held accountable by real metrics and real public sentiment. And in so doing, they fail to realize, I think they think that they're going to incentivize or pressure Batista into reforming his ways. Instead, he ultimately famously flees the island for the Dominican Republic, and Castro moves into Havana, continuing to misrepresent what he's going to do for the people. And then the Cuban people and then the world at large are not well represented either by the American media at that time. So, you can go back, and New York Times coverage is particularly famous for this, and really buying into all of Castro's rhetoric, not describing it as a political promise or something that, they were really either consciously oblivious to the fact that he could violate those promises, or they were part, of basically supporting a propaganda initiative that was designed to depict this man as some sort of humanitarian, when I believe the ultimate legacy of his life, and the legacy of Raul Castro as well, and the legacy of Che Guevara, the legacy of the tyrants they've supported in Chavez, Maduro, Daniel Ortega. These are brutal dictators who did nothing for their people and put personal power and their personal aspirations for that above and beyond any other consideration. That's not a patriot. That's not a hero. That's not any benevolent or philanthropic form of leadership. And yet, this guy, throughout much of his governance, was routinely misrepresented. Obviously in Cuba, which, by the way, I think is ranked as having one of the most controlled media, state media conditions of any country in the world. There's more suppression and repression of independent journalism in Cuba than just about any country. And that's, by the way, that's a developed metric by journalist organizations that have assessed the lack of free press there. And it's a big problem, quite honestly, because it's something, in my own experience with Cuba that I really feel has proved hurtful to the promises of a a constructive revolutionary or non-revolutionary change of government, and that is it's an island nation, right? So already inherently it's cut off from a sort of free flow of information. Like for instance, if you were, if you're in Haiti and you're in one of the poorest countries in the world, but you also know that on that same island is the DR, and that if you cross the border, all of a sudden the conditions improve, right?
They will.
Meaning no Haitian objectively looking at their conditions can feel that there's a geographic underlying cause to that poverty, or that it's somehow unique to that region of the world. So clearly is a product of governmental mismanagement and associated countries that have contributed to that, because right next door is a country that didn't make many of those errors. You can see it in North and South Korea very glaringly there.
We have the United States 90 miles away, but now we are not that welcome as before.
Well, yeah, I mean, so let's be, we, and that's the other thing is that ultimately, so Castro basically forbids Cubans from leaving the island. He was the force behind isolating Cuba, not us. In fact, he early on rejected much of our offer of humanitarian aid. So you'll often hear the left, and particularly Marxists, blame the poverty of Cuba on the U.S. trade restrictions, but in reality, the humanitarian aid we offered, he rejected, and then the aid that we did ultimately get through was misdirected, and simultaneously his economic policies, which preclude really private property ownership largely, and or have barriers to entry that are so high that it becomes not common, and make it almost impossible to own or develop a business as you could in a more market-oriented economy. These are things that just completely stifle job creation, because you cannot run an economy from the top down like that. You can have, and every country must have, macroeconomic and fiscal policies at a federal level, but ultimately, if you don't have the foundational structure that allows individual entrepreneurship to flourish, and God forbid you have a country like Cuba or most communist regimes that actually views these as criminal enterprises and undermining of the regime, you're creating the perfect paradigm for economic collapse. That's been the story now for 6 decades in Cuba.
Well, Michael, my understanding is that you have been pretty much involved in Latin America and all the anti-communist movement over there, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, the contrast there. Also in Africa, where you had to face more than once the Cuban forces that were involved in those conflicts. I have here a note. I have taken a note of what is called the Public Law 87/733 of 1962 of the U.S. Congress that establishes, and I quote, "To prevent by any means, including the arms, the extension of the Marxist regime of Cuba by the use of force or the threat of the use of force to any other country in this hemisphere." That is a law signed and approved by the 2 chambers of the Congress, the Representatives and the Senate. The law signed long ago. Same time, I thought we also...
1953.
1962.
Yeah. So that precedes, so yeah, I'm familiar with that. So that precedes, obviously, the missile crisis, which is probably, I guess, worth walking through it because it contradicts that and it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, it's, I think if you were a strong JFK fan, you would say, wow, this was his best hour. But you would find among many Cubans who had fled under Castro, that they felt the final resolution of that was, a death sentence for Cuba. So, as part of this broader global engagement in Cold War conflicts, Castro invites the Soviets. I mean, that's the way it's worded, invites, but the Soviets were looking to do this, establish medium and intermediate range nuclear missile facilities on the island. And this precedes, of course, satellite imaging. That we would notice this more easily today, but we do have a reconnaissance aircraft that ultimately gets solid videography pictures of the nuclear facilities, and it forces really this missile crisis, which under John F. Kennedy, which you have to say in modern times in the nuclear era is probably about as close as the world has ever come to a nuclear conflict and to World War III. And that's saying a lot because there have been other issues, including in the NATO Warsaw Pact tensions, including in India, Pakistan, and whatnot. But this was really as close as it came, and in part because those facilities should never have been allowed to have been constructed, and we were unaware of them until we did become aware of them. And then, of course, interestingly, as part of that history, Kennedy solicits guidance from his national security team. And the Democratic Party of John F. Kennedy is not the Democratic Party of Joe Biden. They were anti-communists.
They were.
They definitely, it had issues with the way Nixon and Eisenhower before him had governed some foreign policy issues, but they say, look, you got to take out these facilities with airstrikes and invade the island. And that's the guidance that John F. Kennedy is given on how to confront this.
However, the Reagan administration signed a joint resolution of Senate approximately in 1984. I didn't have the chance of getting the number again, the specific code, that reestablished the situation of, in case of the use of force or as an attempt of expansion in this hemisphere, the U.S. will reserve the right to intervene in the island. I mentioned these two elements because it's been 60 years. It's been 60 years, and I am not very keen. It doesn't matter what I think. I'm just the interviewer. But I'm not very keen about the intervention solution. But at the same time, as a beholder, we see that the American politicians have never really considered that option. Not the only moment was in 1962, and there have been two laws that have been signed by the Congress saying this. So how do we play?
Well, and that's kind of where I was going with this. So, first with the Bay of Pigs in 1960, Eisenhower kind of approves the plans for the Bay of Pigs. And this is, the ultimate covert operation where Cubans are recruited and are trained to conduct this covert invasion that was designed to take down the regime because it was perceived to be, and in fact, correctly perceived to be, an emerging Soviet client state in our hemisphere, as you correctly say, 90 miles off the shores of Florida, that was a threat in a whole bunch of ways. But as has often been the case in our history, we go through this transition of government. So, Eisenhower and Nixon. So Eisenhower offloads a lot of the planning to Nixon as vice president, and Nixon. So, the plan is well established. John F. Kennedy sort of inherits it, and I think it's a peculiar decision because in an undertaking of that nature, there's really no middle ground. I mean, you either buy into the plan, you execute it to full success, and this has got lessons also for what we're facing with in Afghanistan right now, right? You either when you commit to engagement militarily, either whether it's involving a U.S. directed initiative or whether you're using surrogate forces, as we did many times in covert initiatives, including in the Bay of Pigs. You don't take the middle ground. But that's kind of what he did. He looked for, he focused more on the political explanation of bad planning, but he allowed the mission to go off.
Yeah.
In retrospect, if you felt that, so it was kind of, in a sense, like he wanted the best of both worlds. I think he was prepared to take credit for the Bay of Pigs if it had succeeded. And I think almost he would not have said, hey, we prevailed, but the planning wasn't good. He would have taken full credit for it. Or you look at it and you say, look, this is an ill-conceived plan. It's not likely to succeed. And you pull the plug on it, and you either do something different or abandon it completely. But he never provided any air cover. And we allowed those patriots to be essentially mowed down on the beaches as they attempted their incursion, and others were caught. It was a complete debacle, and an operation that, in its current context, could have potentially been successful if it was all chips in, but that administration clearly wasn't all chips in. And I'm raising all this by way of saying, so we get to this Cuban Missile Crisis later, and we discover the missiles, and this is Khrushchev in charge in the Kremlin at the time, and Kennedy ultimately insists on a public removal of the missiles, to his credit, a private removal of our missiles in Turkey, which of course is a NATO member, and at that time was facing some degree of serious regional aggression and threats. And we issue this promise to never again attempt to liberate, invade, whatever word you want to use, the island of Cuba. And I'm not a big fan of...
Sorry for interrupting you. That was written somewhere that, if I got you well,
yeah. So part of our
American agreement.
Part of the Soviet and Cuban insistence on removing weapons from Cuba was our agreement that we would never again seek to militarily liberate Cuba. And so a lot of Cubans, a lot of Cubans back in the, so if you go back, late 20th century, 60s, 70s, 80s, that generation is older now, but they felt that Kennedy had sold out the idea of liberating Cuba in making such a promise. I would respond only that, that's probably a promise that shouldn't have been made, but look at the magnitude of the threat we were facing, and look at should we confront a serious threat in Cuba, I assure you we're not going to be constrained by that commitment, I would suspect. I can't imagine that we would be. But you're right. So you got this island nation, it's cut off. We launched Radio Marti famously, Castro blocks that. The free flow of information in Cuba is a really, really important challenge, present tense. I am of the opinion that this regime is immensely unpopular. I wish you could see the emergence of a real opposition force or figure, as we're seeing in Venezuela, even if it's in exile, even if it's not in Cuba, even if it's, in any one of the Caribbean islands or in Miami or wherever. And ultimately see the Cuban people commit themselves to saying, look, we've put up with this communist regime now for 60 years. none of Castro's promises came to fruition. Each year, we're a little more isolated, we're a little poorer, we're a little more hopeless. And this is not the future that we want for this country that is filled, by the way, with enormous promise and once was, as you know, a commercial centerpiece in the hemisphere before the Communist Revolution, and a real vibrant economy, particularly Havana, which was a popular tourist destination and had a lot of signs of potential as it related to its economy. I don't think anyone is looking at the current system right now and saying that there are even signs of potential. And when you're 60 years into an experiment and you don't have any signs of potential, the experiment has failed. And so the experiment of communism in Cuba is a failed one. The experiment of communism in Nicaragua is a failed one. The experiment of communism in Venezuela is a failed one. And the conclusion that we need to reach, if you're not in those three countries, is don't think this couldn't happen to you. Because, you know, it first happened to Cuba.
Even in America.
You know, the Venezuelans, you know, their revolution happened through an election. I mean, Chavez was elected in the lowest turnout in I believe, in the history of Venezuela. They became complacent, and they failed to recognize that liberties and freedoms are not just inherently guaranteed or somehow protected by someone else. You have to be active in their defense or you will lose them. So Cuba should have been the warning alert to the whole hemisphere. It wasn't. 1979, you know, the emergence of the communist regime in Nicaragua under the same sort of series of developments that we had essentially in Cuba, with the United States Carter administration naively cutting off Somoza and empowering the communist insurgency, and the Soviets and Cubans who wanted to see the expansion of communism in Central America. And then, you know, in Venezuela, this sort of complacency that kind of followed the wealthy petroleum era times. I think most Venezuelans would now tell you, you know, yeah, we were aware of what happened in Cuba, but we said we're not Cuba, we're Venezuela. You know, we're bigger than that, or we're somehow immune from that, and they weren't immune to it. And that's got to be the message for even every Western democracy, including the United States of America. Yeah. We are not immune from it. And, you know, go back to those initial cautionary signals and messages that I pointed out, because I didn't just spout them off the top of my head. They're ones that I've carefully observed in communist revolutions in modern times. And we see many of these characteristics emerging in the United States right now. Admittedly, we're a strong and big country, strongest economy in the world. There's a lot to take down if you're going to take down the United States. But, you know, we've now got legitimate questions at the heart of our Constitution, legitimate questions at the heart of the presidency of the United States, legitimate issues as it relates to individuals not elected by the people who are manipulating and maneuvering key governmental institutions, and seemingly suicidal series of steps that we're taking from a policy standpoint that you can only sort of look at and say they're designed to diminish and weaken, not strengthen us. And then on top of it, the final point, a far left in this country that wants to bring out, you know, debates over things that we've made really serious progress on as it relates to racial equality, you know, and that the Republican Party has led and championed, I'll point out, party of Lincoln that ended slavery, the party of the Republican Party that championed and made civil rights legislation in this country possible. For it to be depicted and disparaged as somehow on the other side of that is ridiculous, given the Democrat Party's close connections in opposing the abolishment of those laws. And I, you know, just feel, as I said, that the economic argument is not working for those of Marxist persuasion, and this is the fallback position. This is the way and it's particularly manifesting in, these educational programs that are being laid out that get the people of the country to identify with one side or the other and to view the other side as their enemy. And they're not your enemy. And these aren't present tense battles that we're going to resolve by deepening the divide between us. We continue to improve through assimilation and acceptance and tolerance, which are things, frankly, we've made a lot of progress on. Why we would regress only to deepen this divide and create the environment in which really otherwise unjustifiable political measures could be taken.
Amazing. Thank you. One of the biggest issues between the Cuban-American relations today is the embargo. The embargo was established by the Kennedy administration in 1963, I think, 1964, as retaliation of the expropriation of American companies and nationals living in Cuba. A common sense solution for that issue would be to establish a framework with the Cuban government regime and create a mutual compensation treaty, more fairer than the one before. Which are the elements that, in your point of view, have prevented that treaty to take place and so the end of embargo?
It's been the communist regime in Cuba's unwillingness to take some of the steps that would allow us to comfortably do that. So when I mentioned the fact that this embargo is not designed to change the regime, all right, so let's stop talking about it as a failed policy. It's been a successful policy because it's denied the regime resource. If you gave that regime resources, you have to ask the question, would they do positive things with it or would they do negative things with it? And having confronted the presence of Cuban troops and, my own engagement, Angola, Nicaragua, more recently, and a lot of disruptive and even criminal enterprises and domestic oppression, all of which costs money. These ultimately, as some of my colleagues are defined, not really governments as much as they are criminal enterprises. There's no better example than China's Communist Party. It's never been validated with any support from its people. It's conducting the most horrific and illegal abuses of human rights and, is engaged in this whole fentanyl shipment and many other criminal enterprises that are kind of the foundation of its economic development plans. Same with Cuba. So you can't lift the embargo until you have a commitment from that government that certain things are going to stop and other things are going to begin. And one of those things that needs to begin is, liberalizing the country so there's freedom of expression, so that political parties and political movements can formulate, which they cannot really currently, so that people can peacefully assemble, so that they can have freedom of speech, so that media can be free to report on what's really going on in the country, and that the government ultimately is elected and accountable under the Constitution to the people, not to itself, which is what it is right now. So while the Castros are gone and you get a lot of these Cuba scholars who would say that, Fidel's passing and then Raul's retirement are indicative of a passing of an era. No, it's been inherited a long-standing and global system that uses raw force and brutality to enforce its will and to suppress the people. It's responsible for the killing and jailing of many thousands to this day, including last month, with individuals who were repressed and have been jailed simply for being on the streets, expressing their support for sensible positions and reforms. That is, in a position that I hold very strongly, a human right that the United States, first and foremost, needs to be supporting. And we seem to put forward a lot of rhetoric in support of it. You'll always hear politicians or the State Department say, we stand with the people. But are we really standing with them if we're not actually giving them the tangible means to defend themselves against brutal force? For instance, in Afghanistan right now, are we really standing with the women of Afghanistan or the people of Afghanistan who adopted a constitution when we're about ready to apparently accept a group of thugs who have taken over that country's capital by force and are about, seems to me, ready to develop a terrorist super state aligned with China's Communist Party and nuclear Pakistan? I mean, these are horrifying scenarios. And I'll tell you, it's like I said about the Venezuelan election, the inclination of the American people is to feel someone else is going to take care of it. Someone else will be responsible. It's too big of an issue for me to be involved in. I can't do anything. I'm helpless, or I'm too lazy. This is how freedom falls. This is how freedom is lost. And anyone who has lived under communist oppression, and I've witnessed this over and over and over again, will reiterate that you don't get engaged once everything's fallen. It's too late then. You get engaged at the first indication that we're moving down that path. Well, we had that first indication many years ago. And you know, if the system of government, the 1776 Great Experiment, first time a country in the world was ever formulated on the basis of ideas, not on the basis of a conquest or military expansion or invasion or coups. First time idea, you know, conceived of ideas and formulated a nation that was designed to protect and flourish within the constraints of power that were afforded our government. If we don't actively engage in that process, it will surely demise, because defending freedom is a difficult undertaking. Tyranny's ascent and tyranny's survival is a much easier task, because it's simply one of raw brutality and aggression. And so, you know, you're concerned about, I don't know, the Uyghurs in China. You put 2 to 3 million of them in concentration camps, and you tell the rest of the world you can't come in and look at them. And by the way, there aren't.
It is our internal business.
And don't believe anyone who says that's even happening. It's not happening. Even after our own government affirms that it's happening and that Communist China is engaged in genocidal tactics. When you become permissive of that, the never again promises that we made after the Allied forces liberated the concentration camps, it just become meaningless rhetoric. And to celebrate now, you know, 20 years, commemorate 20 years of 9/11 with this same regime of thugs, comprised some of whom were literally, you know, in U.S. hands, right? At Gitmo, now holding, you know, minister level positions in the Taliban government. And, they just choose a day, to put their, you know, to celebrate the new government being appointed. Let's take, how's 9/11 sound? You know, if you don't see that these are designed globally to undermine and diminish U.S. power, prestige, and influence, both symbolically and in real political terms, you're not paying attention. And I have to caution Americans, Europeans, Australians, many places around, many other countries in Latin America.
They are wondering.
Wake up, man! You know, wake up, because you know, I can see some places where there's some really constructive organization of freedom movements, and then I see, you know, examples where I think the ball's been completely dropped, and we're dropping it in the United States. We are not leading in ways that we need to lead, and we're not carrying on the legacy of this incredibly bold, brave, sacrifice-oriented commitment that generation after generation is paid to freedom's preservation.
Thank you, sir. You know, been decades, but then arrived 2014, and Obama went to Havana to reestablish relations with the former president. He's now in retirement, Raúl Castro. Right after happened some peculiar events that I still have a big issue to establish them in the political situation right now, which is the so-called the Havana syndrome. Do you think there is a base for this syndrome, for this strange event that happened to American diplomats in Havana? Not only Americans, there were some Canadians.
Yeah, look, this is a real unresolved. So, and it's not only happened in Cuba. It's happened literally in Washington D.C. as well. There've been cases literally right outside the White House, and there's these vague symptoms that people have of sort of memory fog or brain fog and disorientation and sort of pain that's similar to fibromyalgia like pain. And you know, some of the better doctors that we have, specialists who evaluate this, you know, they kind of conclude it's got a neurological origin, but it's not really been identified. And this idea of a capability that these regimes have to inflict that magnitude of physical harm on Americans or anyone, and to not be held accountable for it is yeah, it's immensely frightening. And look, that's seen again. Think of in politics. A lot of politics is how do things look? Because people, you know, like I said, sadly, are not always engaged. They're looking on and they're developing opinions. And I think back about that baseball game with Obama and Raúl Castro and his communist colleagues all sitting there laughing, having a good time. And you're thinking about, I don't know, for me, Armando Valladares, you remember, and his big book on oppression in Cuba and the thousands of people sitting in solitary confinement in concrete jails throughout that island nation right now for no other reason than they spoke up or did something disproving or disagreeing with the communist regime. To have the leader of the free world there celebrating the regime and not the people is the wrong message. You stand with the people and do it in tangible ways and against this regime unless and until it starts indicating that it wants to, you know, make something of the country other than, you know, a handful of people rich and powerful, which is all it's all communism is delivering right now. It's got nothing for these people that Castro spoke to in the Sierra Maestro when he brought, you know, he would hand out food. They would all come up to see him, and he, you know, give them a big long political speech as he did so famously, filled with promises, none of which have come to fruition. This revolution was a lie. I guess we can forgive those who fell for it, but you can't forgive those who in the present tense are refusing to deal with the real human and other ramifications of it. One of which is, you know, we can't even open an embassy in Havana without our diplomats leaving there with these bizarre neurological-like conditions that ostensibly are some sort of radiation or other sort of remote attack on them. It's a big mystery. It's an important one. I'm talking about a lot of people.
And its implications are to see, yeah. Very hard to predict what's going to happen with that. You know, as a Cuban person, I got shocked when November 2020, right after the election situation that happened in the U.S., the attorney Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell both mentioned it, among other countries, that kind of involvement in Cuba in a kind of fraud scheme in the U.S. election. Do you think that it's based to make such accusation?
I didn't like strategic from a legal strategy standpoint, and even from a public information strategy standpoint. I don't think you make the allegations and then go out and try to prove them. I think you bring the proof, you file. If you're going to do it, I don't think any of it belonged in the courts for the most part. It mostly belonged in state legislatures. Even favorable court rulings would have sent it back to state legislatures. But I found it unusual. I found it very destructive strategically. And I'm one who has, read the Navarro reports. I've read the Texas AG filing with the Supreme Court. I've read many of the affidavits, and I've spoken with some whistleblowers. And I believe that the forensic audits are warranted in all 6 states. But you don't advance that cause when you make a bunch of allegations and then fail to really demonstrate that they're accurate. And these are experienced people. These aren't amateurs. They've tried cases many times, and I cannot imagine that that's the way they tried those cases. I imagine that they would, assemble the evidence. You go in and you file whatever it is. And I immediately thought, as I watched that, because at that time I was less concerned about the strategic move than I'm like about the protection of the evidence protection, right? That's one thing that you could have done legally, even without demonstrating anything, is you could have gone in and asked these courts to preserve and to secure these systems so that they're not tampered with by the owners of them or by any political figures that might have been hypothetically, I guess we have to say, mixed up in anything related to altering voter counts. But when you give these powerful companies, and they make a lot of money on these systems, in the worst case scenario, if they were, as they alleged, engaged in any fraud, anybody who's bold enough to do that is going to be bold enough to take steps to cover it up. And that's now months and months and months ago. And you can see in Arizona alone how they're continuing to refuse to cooperate with, the state Senate's legitimate subpoena authority to oversee and be responsible for these elections. And, honestly, on a federal level, no one's taken these things seriously. Even the most basic fundamental things like individuals who no longer reside in their state or county but voted there anyway. Why have we not backed those votes out? Why have those people, I don't know what the criminal penalty is for it, but it's not nothing. Why have they not been cited on this? It just seems to me to be a complete neglect of what are some issues that are highly documentable and could be immediately addressed, some of which, like passing or altering voter policies without having them passed as statutes by the state legislature, are clearly illegal and against the state constitution. Why have those not been addressed and resolved and the individuals held accountable? What other field could you just go out and, like you and I, just decide, this law, we're just going to change it and make it this and not run it through the state legislature? But that's precisely what happened in Georgia. It's precisely what happened in Wisconsin. Drop boxes, these drop boxes weren't provided for in any rule of law, and they were paid for, also important to note, with private funding sources. So I look at all these individuals who've had these citations because they violated campaign giving statutes and whatnot, where they've maybe given more than they were allowed to or something like that. Imagine coming in with millions of dollars, as was done in a number of cases, including one big owner of a big social media company, and providing this money to just go out and establish protocols that aren't accounted for in the rule of law. The donation itself is an in-kind donation to a party because it had a partisan design, and it was clearly thus subject to campaign finance limitations in the contribution amount. And it was further not permissible to alter any of these election procedures or processes without having them pass those statutes through the state legislative bodies. So it's outrageous that it happened, but to me, in some ways, it's more outrageous that there's not more outrage about what actually happened, regardless of who you voted for, regardless of who you support. This is how a system, like I said, basically falls apart, is people become, basically
Untouchable.
ambiguous, or there's, lackadaisical, unconcerned. These are huge concerns to me.
Thank you, sir. The 11th of July, the whole world experienced the largest massive protests in Cuba, demonstrations. Some of them were rallies, others were basically riots along the island. Plenty towns and cities, documented in almost 60 towns in the Cuba island. And there was a huge reaction in the Cuban American community in the U.S. We experienced a lot of solidarity of both sides of the aisle. Still, some voices in that exile are still with their rights. They are very unsatisfied with the response of the Biden administration, and even when the Republican leadership, they went to Miami to listen to them, still no response to any of their demands. Seems that the narrative of the fact, some people are saying, well, they took the street, but it was not enough. Others saying we can help providing internet. Others say, let's do business with the government and that will improve the life. Other people, even more progressive leftists, were saying the Cuban people took the streets asking for vaccines and food. How would be the appropriate response of the Cuban, of the American government toward the events of the 11th of July? What are your thoughts about those events and what it takes to make a real revolution in Cuba, if you can give me that example?
Yeah, because you look at the end of the Cold War, and it's pretty universally viewed correctly as a positive development. But one thing that was always alive during the Cold War was this possibility that we would assess or identify some strategic justification in which some U.S. incursion would be necessary to oust a regime that clearly was a Soviet client state right off of our border and engaged in very threatening policy steps, both in Cuba and in the hemisphere and around the world. That's over now, and that means that the prospect for anything of that nature occurring, in my view, is almost nil. So the future of Cuba inherently falls to the hands of the people of Cuba, which, last I checked, about 11 million people on the island. The powers are in the numbers, ultimately. And I've seen, as I've watched, the women's movement there, the mothers of the political prisoners, all these little movements that have emerged. I really salute them for doing that. That's very brave and bold of them, and I've weighed in and supported them for what that's worth. But for somebody like me that wants to see, and I think the American people who would like to see change on that island, it's going to ultimately take a sizable percentage of that 11 million people to be in the street. So I think that's the obvious answer. So, you look like, how would a change of regime occur? Well, there's not any apparent indication that there's any election coming anytime soon that would be free and fair, or where political parties could organize. There's no indication of any military incursion from the U.S. or elsewhere that would be liberating. And this island nature geographically really leaves the burden on these 11 million people. The only positive thing is in my view, the vast lion's share of those people, from everything I've witnessed, experienced, heard, and seen, which is a lot, would welcome change. Now you've got people that are, committing their lives to that cause. You got people that are doing a little bit here and there, and then you got people who will support it when it looks like it's going to be successful, right? That's like any undertaking of significance, is that momentum builds. And what the important thing that you noted was, I don't know if you know the time, this is the largest street presence that's existed in Cuba in 62 years. Yeah. And while it was fairly brutally broken up and people were jailed, including a priest, I think the people got the better of that engagement, and I hope they feel empowered by it, and they got to continue doing it. Because if you look at any sort of change of regime of this nature where it's proven successful, and there are examples you can look at, the persistence of the people in support of it is the one commonality. This isn't going to get done with 10 people or 100 people or 1,000 people. I think it's going to take at least a third of that country on the streets, but ultimately you reach critical mass, and at critical mass, even a peaceful street presence makes that government unsustainable. And I don't believe there's any government of the world that is going to intervene to shut down half the country if they're demanding change, right? So there is no election. The people can't express their displeasure with the regime that way. But the way they did it in July is the way to do it. And you need to do it bigger and better and consistently. Because believe it or not, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. One day, this regime will fall. I am shocked that I'm sitting here in 2021 and it's still there. Honestly, I guess I really underestimated its sustainability, particularly in the post-Cold War era. I figured with that, absent, but you've seen, foreign powers of the world still more than willing to do business. And by the way, we need to take positions with our allies too, and encourage them to adopt our position. I mean, it's absurd to see, NATO allies enriching this government with their trade policies on Cuba. That would be a logical and sensible next step for anyone that wants change there, is that, if we're obligated under the Articles of the NATO Convention state to send our kids to die to defend these countries from any external attack, I don't think it's too much to ask that they in turn join us in not enriching and empowering and further entrenching a communist regime off of our shores that has jailed and killed thousands and represents a tangible threat to humanity and the will of the people on that country.
Thank you, sir. Next year will be the summit of the Americas, and this will be just a question that will deliberate speculations because we might not have all the facts. But do you think the Biden administration will invite the Cuban government to the United States and talk and sit like Obama used to do before? Or there are no elements for saying anything about that?
I think we're caught up in a great power game right now involving China. China, has engaged with this regime, including in a military context. I don't think there's anything particularly politically popular about steps toward embracing this regime or bestowing any further legitimacy on it. And the only thing I could say is that if you step up the pressure, if the people increase the pressure domestically and we increase the pressure externally, including maybe by getting NATO and other countries of the world to join in the embargo, maybe ultimately you can incentivize that regime to sit down and agree to just some basic principles like the rule of law, liberty, protection of rights, human rights, living up to treaties they've signed, demilitarizing the country. It's ridiculous, the amount of resources that are being spent there militarily, and disengaging from criminal activities, and ultimately holding, and developing a multi-party state. I mean, this idea that democracy can only work in the United States is absurd, and it's untrue. And it's, and we're not the origin of democracy. We are the origin of a great form of government. But, this goes back to the Greeks, and, that's a long tradition. It certainly, and it once did work in Cuba, and it could and should again.
Would you agree with a kind of first package of measures, such as disengagement of criminal activities, demilitarization, respect for human rights and rule of law, and that would be like a transition that with a specific timeline for new elections? It doesn't have to happen automatically. It doesn't have to be, I lift the embargo, let's make business, but only if you do elections.
Yeah,
How would be the mechanic of an agreement that will be okay for both sides?
The trust building process, given that there's some distrust obviously on both sides, and maybe some basis for it, probably some good basis for it on both sides. It's a step-by-step incremental process. So we charge the government Cuba with taking step A, and then we take a step in that direction. They take a step, we take a step. It doesn't have to be all or nothing right away. And it's probably too ambitious to think that they would want to do that, or even that we would want to do that. I'm not, because you get old elections and they're not free and fair. Or they don't abide by the results, or they put together a great constitution and then suspend it. All these things have great historical precedent, including in Cuba. So, it's got to be a real reformation, and that's where the battle against communism becomes difficult, because you're dealing with people that don't just have a personal stake in it, but have some degree of deepened sort of ideological animosity toward these concepts of the individual over the collective. They believe in the value of the collective. That's how 100 million people have been slaughtered by communism since the Bolshevik Revolution, not by accident, but by the theory that the collective is more valuable than the individual, and that 100 million lives were expendable for the purposes of their perception of that collective, not even a real objective assessment of it. The future of Cuba lies in these 11 million, in the hands of these 11 million Cubans, and I think they're increasingly aware of what's going on. One thing the U.S. needs to do is we need to pick up the free flow of information. I think that's liberating and empowering to the people of Cuba. I'd like to see more of it done. I worked with a broad organization supported by the U.S. government that does those sort of things that Reagan established. Kind of was the idea was, these are covert initiatives. Why are they covert? We should be proud of what we're doing about it. And that makes sense if we can do it, and if we can maintain our own integrity and moral authority on these themes. That's another reason November 3 becomes really important to me, not just as it relates to the present tense, but as it relates to the message and credibility we have with the rest of the world, where, for a while I would go around and sort of instruct developing democracies or even non-democratic countries about how to set up a civil society, how to set up an election. I can remember being in Kuwait and engaging with a woman who was arguing with me about why there shouldn't be women's right to vote and things of that nature. But exposure to these concepts is important, not just in an ideological way, but in an operational way, because they can, a free society is a much more complicated society to run than a totalitarian or autocratic one is. With their sole authority is do whatever you